warm welcome to those of you joining us today for this afternoon's webinar. I'm Brian Irvin, Comms and Engagement here at CRAE. As you may already know, here at the Centre for Research in Autism and Education, we're a team of autistic and non-autistic staff and students based within UCL's Institute of Education and part of the Department of Psychology and Human Development. Here at CRAE, we aim to conduct high-quality, cutting-edge research, but also to ensure that the results of that research reach those who stand to benefit from it. This CRAE webinar series is just one part of that, allowing people both within and beyond academia to hear from some of the key researchers, practitioners, and advocates in the field. Through everything we do at CRAE, we take a participatory approach, which means we work with autistic people in all the stages of our research and initiatives, from the initial design right through to the sharing of the outcomes. We hope that this means that the work we do is both meaningful for the wider community and meaningful for those who we engage with. At this point, I'd like to say a big thank you to our funders, supporters, and team members who contribute to our work and make it all possible. In particular, a special thank you to Pears Foundation for their generous, ongoing support that underpins everything that we do. As always, we invite you to become part of the conversation, either in the chat or more anonymity in the Q&A. We'll stop the recording at this point, or we'll pause the recording at this point and endeavour to have as many questions answered as we can by our speaker. If the questions are good, if it works, we'll then put it all up on YouTube later on. Today, we have the excellent Spencer Haynes. Spencer is a developmental psychologist here at UCL's Institute of Education. His work is interested in how performing motor skills influences the ways that children engage in their daily life and they perform at school. He's a member of the Centre for Educational Neuroscience and serves as the co-chair of the Pan-London Schools Autism Network for Research, that's PLASNR. In this role, he helps lead a network that links researchers and schools to support the co-production of autism research alongside autistic children. Spencer, it's so good to have you with us. It's now over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for the introduction, Brian, and the invitation to speak at CRAE. And that was one of the reasons that I looked to join UCL many years ago, was to look for opportunities to collaborate with CRAE, because it's a wonderful centre, and it influences how I look at my work. And I work with Brian also on the PLASNR network as well. So thank you, Brian, for that contribution as well. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing here at UCL, and also in my previous institution in Liverpool. And as the first slide indicates, then I'm interested in movement, and that comes in many facets, in terms of physical activity, motor competency, motor control systems that underpin how we engage within all forms of life, from cycling a push bike to using a set of chopsticks or using a pen or sending texts, all that kind of stuff. So it's really an important aspect of how I think about research. For many years, I've always conducted participatory research with the community, and I'm very eager to continue to disseminate the findings in an appropriate way with the people that are most engaged in this system as well. So that's our partners and the wider community. So that's kind of who I am. I picked this title today to keep it short, and it's related to moving. So that's movement. Unpredictable, which we'll talk about a bit later, which is about variability and within the environmental system that we are learning in. So my background, as indicated in the top left of this slide, then, I trained as an aeronautical engineer, not as a developmental psychologist, because I was principally interested in kind of systems in aircraft. And I retrained in my 20s to look at sport and exercise science and sport and exercise psychology. And I had the wonderful opportunity to work in a Special Olympic Centre in Cheshire. and I worked on programs such as wheelchair basketball and bocce and those types of activities, rhythmic gymnastics. And it really kind of changed my kind of viewpoint on adaptive psychology and how I was working at the time too, because I was coaching football and soccer with children, both here and in the US. And and in the top right here, this is my undergraduate um, degree dissertation. So when I left my aircraft training work, I went to university and studied sport and exercise psychology, and I got really interested in learning. And this particular study was looking at how young children learn to cascade juggle, and that kind of really shaped how I thought about work and how I thought about research. And my mentor, Professor Digby Elliott from McMaster University, asked me when I was having a meeting with him in Hamilton, which is in Ontario. He was asking me why I was interested in autism research, and I spoke to him about some of the papers I've been reading, some of the theories I've been reading, and he said that's really brilliant. Why are you interested in autism research? And I said, well, I think this paper's interested in this research theoretical idea of observational learning and imitation is important. And he said, okay, cool. What do you know about autism research? And I said, well, there are these cool papers on autism research and these theories. And he said, okay, so you essentially know nothing about autism research. And I said, okay. And he said, you should go home to the UK and work with the community. So I worked with this community here, which is on this slide, which is called Autism Together, which is a charity on the Wirral in the northwest of England. And I worked with these guys. We volunteered once a week in their charity, and I learned so much. This was back in 2012, so some time ago now. Um, and I learned so much about participatory research, autism, co-production, working with the community, dissemination, etc. So it was a significant part of my kind of understanding and training. And so I thank these guys tremendously for their opportunities that they gave me. Um, I also worked in other areas of the local community in Liverpool. This is a trampolining centre for young children in Liverpool. Again, I worked as a volunteer there in a trampolining centre, um, and this was designed specifically for young children to go to a trampolining centre on Saturday mornings, integrate with other families that have autistic children, and it was a wonderful experience also to consider. When I was there, I was talking to families, etc., about the type of work I was doing. I was doing some work in physical activity using trampolines, and it was a really interesting way to sit on the side of a gymnasium like this, for example, and disseminate kind of ideas of what we were doing. So that was another way that I've kind of shaped my current work now, which is in autism research, but principally looking at how we disseminate our findings and how we shape our research questions with the community. Um, One of the first times that we disseminated our findings in Liverpool, um, this is a quote from an autistic young person um, who volunteered to be in one of our studies. And when we fed back some of the research findings to the volunteers, he mentioned afterwards to me that this is the first time in my life that someone from outside of my support network, which is Autism Together, or his family, has actually spoken to me about the findings, what they mean, and what I felt about them. And that really had a profound effect on me in terms of how I thought about research, the importance of co-production, and how we treat our volunteers in that process. And so that was really, as I stated, quite profound actually in the way that I now consider what I do and all of my work that we do um, is with the community, but importantly, we always feed back to the community afterwards. And we set up, and I set up long-standing relationships with our partners, some of which I've been working with for now over 10 to 15 years. So it's a big part of my work. Um, so today I'm going to talk about my principal interest, which is in sensory motor learning, so the acquisition of skills. So if we look at this center icon here, then this is a person kicking a football. This is a person cycling a push bike, and this is a person executing a movement um, on the phone. We often see this walking around the streets. So sensory motor being processes related to sensations. So in lots of kind of motor learning studies, it's looking at visual motor relationships. So the utilization of vision, for example, of the ball in this context here. So visual processes of the ball and how the ball is relative to the foot, and then the interaction in between these kind of motor processes that are operating the foot and how we control an object. And this just happens to be a football, but it could be any other object as well. In this instance, it's a phone, for example, or this instance, it's a kind of a walking aid. But what that's doing is it's the integration of these systems. And there's kind of lots of evidence now to show that sensory motor processing differences are pervasive across autism. And I'll use autism here, but within the autism spectrum condition, there are generally lots of sensory motor processing differences that shape how movements are executed in autism, and that's one of the things that I've been working on for some time and are continuing to do today. Um, in children, there is some recent evidence suggests that in motor skills, these are foundational skills here. Then, so 87% of children, autistic kids, show motor skills differences in the execution of movements. So movements such as running and walking, so these gait type activities or jumping tasks. Or where you interact now with objects, um, whether it's to kick an object that goes away from the body or is to move an object to hit to an object that's coming towards you. And these are foundational movements that underpin how we operate in larger environments. So how you locomote around a school, for example, how you queue up in a dinner queue, and how these processes then underpin how we then go on to do other educational activities like handwriting, for example, reading and mathematics. So these sorts of processes are also underpinned by sensory motor processes, and that's the kind of the basis of my work at the moment. Um, so I'm going to walk you through um, three studies that are connected. And then I'm happy to take some questions at the end on some of the work that we're doing at the moment here at UCL. And there's lots of information that I haven't put into the presentation, but I'm more than happy to provide additional information at the end, or I've left my email address at the end of the slide, which you can also email me if you want to get some other information. So this is a study that we conducted a number of years ago now, which looks at um, motor planning, so how you plan movements, and how that impacts on how we learn skills. So the title is Getting Off to a Shaky Start. Specificity in motor planning, so how we plan movements, for example. So if I'm planning to hold a pen here to write my name, for example, or if I'm holding a glass of water here to execute movement to have a drink, I'm now beginning to generate sensory motor plans that enable me now to control my hands to make the correct force movements and the correct directional movements. So we looked at this in a learning context, and that's something that I'm interested in now is these kind of learning parameters. So the study that we did was this is a study with adults, and I'm going to talk to you about some work that we did with younger children in a second. But these were with autistic adults with an age of about 25, and the task that we asked them to do was a computer-based task, which is very common in psychological kind of studies, where a person sits on a desk in front of a tablet. This is like a big iPad, and they use a stylus, like a pen, on the tablet, or they can use a mouse. And what they have to do then is move on this tablet to move a cursor on a screen, and they go from the left-hand target to the central target. And then the second movement is to do a reversal, so they go back to where they came from, and then the third movement goes from the left all the way to the right. So it kind of looks like 1, 2, 3, which looks like this video. 1, 2, 3. So that's the task. And so what they do then is they make this 3 segment movement. And at the end of their movement, we give them feedback. And that feedback tells them whether they were too slow at the movement goal or whether they were too fast at the movement goal. And we set a particular time. Often we get asked questions like, well, how does this relate to the real world? Essentially, what this is, it's a goal-directed task. So when you're moving your cursor to this object, it's exactly like when you're pointing your bicycle to go through a gap in a pavement, for example, or it's when you're moving your pencil to draw the letter A, for example, and you're doing the first stroke, you have to stop at an end point. Or if you're using a spoon in a bowl of cornflakes, for example, when you put the spoon towards your mouth, there's an end position. So this is kind of simulating these kind of underlying processes. So the task that these people were asked to do then was to learn a particular goal, this movement time goal. So we set a time that they have to learn, and then we watch how they learn over a period of practice trials. An important thing about this then is we're looking at now practice. And practice is a repeated number of attempts at the goal. And that can range from anywhere from 10 or 15 trials, for example, up to thousands of trials, depending on what you're asked to do. So that's the general task of this here. But as I said, this is a 3 segment. So that's 1, 2, and 3, and they get feedback on the screen. And that repeats for the next trial, 1, 2, 3, and they get feedback again on the computer screen, and so on. Okay, so this is the data from the study, and what you have here then on the y-axis here, this is data presented to what we call total error. So a 0 value would be a perfect score. Okay, so if the target time was 1 second and they did a movement that was 1 second, they would then get a score of 0. If they did a movement time of 2,200 milliseconds, so they were too slow, then they would have an error score around about here on the y-axis. So from a visualization perspective, a lower value is better performance. Okay. And on the x-axis here, then this is what we call our phases of the study. So this is the early part of the study. So when they first start learning, this is at the end of the learning phase, and this is what we call retention. And retention is a period of time after they've learned. So very much like an examination at school, you learn some things in class, and at a distributed point in time, you're asked to come back and do that again, and then they examine those processes. This is a classic sort of learning protocol here. So practice phase, this is where you learn, or what we call acquisition, which is the acquisition of a skill, and then we test it later from a learning point of view. So what we show here then is changes in performance. So this is the autistic group. This is the non-autistic group in grey, and this is the autistic group in black. And what you find is you get changes in performance. They become more accurate, or they're less errorful over time, indicating that they've acquired the processes of adaptation to this particular skill. And then when we ask them then to come back later, there is some kind of retention of that information as this line plateaus off along here, and this line plateaus pretty much across here. What we found here then is the autistic group are different than the non-autistic group, which is consistent with lots of studies that are in the literature. And when you look at it in a retention period, the autistic group are significantly different than the neurotypical group. So that's the general learning profile of these autistic adults. Important thing to take then is that learning takes place and that acquisition is retained after a period of time, but there are differences in how those two groups are learning. So this data here is important for one principal reason for today then, which is these are um, visualizations of how the cursor is moving across the screen. If you remember on the top right hand corner here, then you had the first movement where the chap went from the left hand side to the central point here, and that's illustrated on this figure here, figure A, which is called segment one. So this is segment one up here, and this is segment one down there. Segment two is when you do this reversal, which is in the central point here, and then segment three is the larger segment that finalizes, which ends here, and that's that longer movement towards the end. Okay. Um, and basically, what I'd like to illustrate then is this data on the left-hand side here, which is in A, C, and E. The important visualization to locate your attention on then is the differences in the colors. So this color here, which is like a red pinky color, asked one of my colleagues this morning because I'm actually colorblind. So this distribution here then, so this is the variability for the autism group, and this is the variability for the non-autistic group. And what you find in the learning parameters then is that there's greater variation in their movements. This is in the early phase of movement, and this is in the late phase of movement, and this is at the end of the retention period over here. So this greater variation now then indicates that although they're doing the similar pattern of movement, because it's constrained, you'd expect that anyway to do the task. It's just that the variability in their movement is wider. So there's probably about twice as much variability in the way that autistic people are learning these tasks. They still learn the task, no problem. They retain it after a period of time, but it's just a variation in their movement that is different, and that might be contributing then to some of the differences that we see in their movement time performance, and also probably some forms of motor planning. So take home message from this slide then really is just to think about this kind of differences in the variability. This slide now then is a slide that illustrates a marker of motor planning. So motor planning means if you visualize now, or if you think about if you're holding your phone, for example, in your hand, and you want to make a movement to one of the buttons on the side, you want to increase the volume or you want to turn your phone off, you have to move your finger to press the button. That is a process of motor planning. So you have to think about what your finger has to do, what it has to do on the phone, and then you make this executed movement. This marker here is what we call peak acceleration. So it's a marker that tells us something about how the system, the motor system, is operating when we plan our movements. So on the y-axis here, then we have spatial variability, and all this means is how consistent you are in when you plan your movements. Okay. And on the y-axis here, then we have our segments like I just showed you. So segment one is the first segment, segment two is the second segment, so the reversal, and segment three is the longer third phase of the movement. Specifically, the patterns then is the autistic group then are in the black as previously illustrated, and the grey lines are the non-autistic group, and we still get this kind of these are group differences in the variation. So the variability between the groups are also consistent in motor planning. So that's here and here and here and here. So these are significant differences in motor planning variability. So they're performing the task in a comparable way, but there are differences in the variability, so they're not as consistent with how that movement is planned. Importantly, what you show here then is a decrease in variability in the second segment. So this is showing that with practice then, and remember this is the early phase of practice and this is the late phase of practice. So early in the movement learning, they have this level of variability, which is quite high at 20 millimeters. But after practice here, then they've decreased this down to about 15, 14 or 15. So from an illustrative point of view, what you're showing is practice leads to a decrease in variability. So that's good. So you're more consistent with how you're hitting your goals. So there's evidence in this first study then that there are differences in how autistic people learn these tasks. They perform the tasks in terms of their goals. They meet the goals. They learn the task. They retain it after a period of time. But we're just showing increases in variability about how the movement system is operating, specifically around how you plan those movements, but also how that may change over time. So this is a study, this is a second study now with autistic children. We're going to submit this paper probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And so these are my colleagues that are on the paper. And in this particular task then, we carried this out in a school in North Wales. So this is my colleague that works at Birmingham now, and this is the head teacher from an autistic school in Flint in North Wales. And this is one of the home economics rooms in the school. So we set our study up in their home economics room. We co-produced the task. So the design of the task on the left-hand side over here was carried out with autistic children and teaching assistants. These are cameras that we can measure the movements. So these are like sophisticated iPhones that can record what your movement is doing. And the task here then for children was to sit at this table here and move the frog from the beginning lily pad here to move it to the central lily pad and move it to the final lily pad. And at the end of here, there we had a teaching assistant, which would be helping the child in a dyadic learning environment. So dyadic meaning in two people. So you got, if you imagine, then you had a child here and a teaching assistant, and the teaching assistant would instruct the child to make the movement, which was to move the frog to the central lily pad and to the end lily pad. And that was the task. So these kids were aged 14. They had from this measurement here, which is called motor assessment battery for children. This gives us an indication of motor competency. So these scores are actually quite low. So this is indicate, well, this score here, this score for the non-autistic children is in a typical range, and this score for autistic children is in a severe, a lower range in terms of motor competency. So there's evidence here then of kind of motor differences on a separated task. Okay, so here's the task then. So if we look at the top line, so A and B. So as I told you then, so this is the board that you just saw. This is the yellow lily pad, the blue lily pad, and the red lily pad. This is the child, and this is the teaching assistant. So we had two different conditions. One condition is that the teaching assistant delivered the instructions verbally with no arm movements. And in this context down here, it's exactly the same situation, but in this context here, the teaching assistant uses their arm to give an informational gesture, which is they pointed to the target. So this is, we want you to move to this target with a combination of the movement gesture. Okay, and in one context, they had to make one movement, which is just from yellow to blue, so one movement and stop. And then in the other context over here, they had to make two movements, yellow to blue, and then blue to red. Okay, so the main differences in the tasks, I'm only going to focus on one specific effect for this particular study, but from a task perspective, the teaching assistant either made an informational gesture or not. And in most teaching contexts, teachers use informational gestures to help support the delivery of instructions. So I want you to make a big movement or a small movement, versus if I just gave those verbal instructions would be, I want you to make a big or small movement, versus I want you to make a big or small movement. So the combination of verbal and hand gestures are shown to be more facilitatory for learning. But we were principally interested in how children moved the frog between these two targets. Okay, and here's some of the findings. On the left-hand side, we have movement time, and then on the x-axis here, then this is the movement time for one segment, which was the first task, remember, and then on the second task here, when they had to move to two targets, which was 1, 2, we have some different data. So first of all, then on the left-hand side, we have the non-autistic children and we have the autistic children. And for this particular task here, they were asked to move the frog as accurately and as quickly as possible. And what you see here then is the autistic children are better than the non-autistic children at completing the task. They're actually faster to complete the task um, in this particular context. When you move to the second condition, which has two movements, one, two, the first movement, we call it segment one, but it's the first movement from the yellow to the blue target. The autistic children are faster. And then on the second segment, the children are the same. There's no difference between these two bars, look. And then the total score now then for this particular task is there's no difference between the autistic children in black or dark gray and the non-autistic children in light gray. But importantly, what you find for this particular measure here, this is called dwell time. And what dwell time is calculated is when you have to make two movements, one, two, the dwell time is how long you spend on the middle lily pad before you execute your second movement. So it's one, dwell, and two. So what you find here then is autistic children spend about 50% more time on that dwell time when they get to the central location, the central lily pad. So what this explains is they're faster on the first movement, they're the same on the second movement, but they're just spending 50% more time on the phase of the task. So the task overall, there's no difference between the children and how they perform the task in terms of the total time, but actually the way that they execute and plan the movement is different because the autistic children spend 50% more time planning their movement. So in the first study that we showed, then there were differences in motor planning in adults. In the second study here, we showed the same again. Then so performance is better in some instances, the same in others, but different here than in terms of motor planning. So there are across this kind of developmental spectrum of 24-year-olds and then 11-year-olds, you're showing these sort of commonalities with motor planning differences. And motor planning differences here then might be important if you think about it, is that performance is the same, but if autistic children are spending twice as long planning movements in a particular classroom setting, then what might be happening is they perform less activities, not because they can't perform as well, they just spend more time executing the movements. That planning phase is having a constrained effect on their performance. Okay, so that's an interesting finding from a motor planning point of view for these children. So this data here then also shows variability. If you look on the left top slide here then, on the y-axis here then, we have variability. A 0 score would be you're always very consistent, and a higher score now means that you're less consistent. Okay. And this is for the first segment. So this is one movement. And on the bottom, then you have two movements. So this is movement one, which we call segment one, and movement two, which we call segment two. And the pattern to focus your attention on then is that these are the non-autistic children here then. So their variability then is pretty consistent across these four different markers. Okay. And this is the autistic children. Their variability increases across these two markers, which I'll explain in a second, and then decreases on the final marker. Okay, and the same pattern evolves down here. This is movement one. Autistic children are more variable, so the difference between the grey line here and the black line here is indicated in the variability. So they're just less consistent with how they move, and exactly the same here. If we colour this in now here, this line here is lower. The autistic children are less consistent and more variable in their movement. And these markers here then, peak velocity in their movement and peak velocity in their movement. Now, here, these are markers in the motor learning and control world, which are explaining and examining motor planning. So again, what we're finding then is differences in motor planning, how they plan and execute the beginning parts of their movement are different in autistic children. So what we wanted to do then in our final study that I'm going to show you today then is to try and harness this variability in a learning protocol And this study was conducted by Tuğçe Setiner, which was one of my PhD students. She's finished a PhD now, so it's Dr. Setiner, and she's back working in Turkey. And also my colleague, Professor Jovan Hoegen and Professor Simon Bennett are part of this study. And you can find this on the Open Science Framework. And this paper will be submitted for publication in the next 1 or 2 weeks. So this study now looked at practice. So can practice make perfect? And we're looking at specificity of practice in this study. And this has been studied in the motor learning literature for a very long time. And back in the 1970s, there's a phenomenon called contextual interference. And I'm going to explain to you now what contextual interference is, because we did that in this study with these young children in this particular study. So contextual interference means that we have two ways that you practice skills. In the first way, you have task A, you have task B, and you have task C. Okay, task A might be holding your hand like this. Task B might be putting your finger up like this, and task C may be doing something like this, like a scissors. Okay, so three different tasks. Okay, here then, in what we call blocked practice, you learn the tasks in a consistent fashion. You do task A first, 1, 2, 3, followed by the next task, 1, 2, 3, followed by the third task, which is 1, 2, 3. So this is called block practice because you're doing the trials in a consistent way. Same, same, same. And in a random practice condition, the tasks are all they are variable or random between trials. So you do A, followed by B, followed by A, followed by C, followed by C, and so on. What happens in these contexts then is that you get trial to trial stability when you're doing the same task over and again. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This means that your trial, one trial, two trial, three trial, is very consistent because you're doing the same thing over and over again. And this helps with the integration and consolidation of how this task feels and how it's performed. And this generally leads to better performance, but importantly, it has poorer learning, which we'll talk about a bit later. In the random condition, we have, because you're performing task A, which is that context here, then you have to do task B on the next one. So you've got to not do this and then do this next movement. And then you do the next movement again, which is here. And then the next movement is that movement. So what happens is between these trials, we get what is called variation. So there's different processing, different brain processing between executing task A and executing task B. What happens is here then is there is greater increase in forgetting. So you're forgetting what this felt like because you're now doing a different task and so on. This makes it a more difficult task to perform, so it increases your effort, your cognitive processing increases. But importantly now, what happens is because you've done A followed by B, you're beginning to learn the relationships between A and B because now you're going back to A, so you're learning that relationship, now you're going to C. So it's now a different relationships, you're learning this relationship and so on. So in this context, then, although it's harder, there are different processes that you do. So we worked with young autistic children. These are aged 4 in reception class in a school in London. These are their cognitive profiles, which are below average, measured through the general cognitive ability. Executive function is significantly elevated. These are just descriptions for purposes of this presentation. And these are the childhood autism rating scales, which are in the severe range. Okay, so these are autistic children aged 4 in a special school in London, an autism special school. So this is the study design then. We have the first group, which did block practice in the first instance, followed by random practice. This is the same task over and over again, then it's randomized. Then the second group did the randomized condition first, but the block condition second. So it's a kind of a crossover design study. Group 1, 4-year-olds, group 2, 4-year-olds, but they do blocked first, random second, random first, block second. Okay, so we're looking at the specificity of how you learn here. And then we bring them back a month later and we do a retest a month later. We trained them on novel letters. So these are Turkish letters. We trained them on novel letters because it's a novel learning task. So the young children in English schools don't learn Turkish symbols. So these are brand new skills to learn. And then we had some familiar skills to learn so we can look at motor transfer. We can compare between the two tasks. So we sent out the instruments to families in the post. It's called AIMS, Autism Intervention Motor Skills. So these were sent to parents and families. In the pack, then they had a booklet to practice on, some instruction sheets on how to do it, some pencils and some stickers when they finished the tasks, and some motivators like a little car toy. Along with the information there, we sent them links to a YouTube video which showed them how to do the task. So this is a simulation, and this will be the parent or carer and the young child. This is the booklet on a table. There's the pencil here then, and they had to perform the tasks in a book at home. This is what we call the AIMS intervention. So this is the booklet, and it is a booklet which is a storybook which designs to travel around the world. Okay. And what children have to do then is put their pencil in the start, trace over the lines and finish here. In this context, that's the first shape. The second shape is to put the pencil here, go to the bottom, whoops, go to the bottom and then do the second movement. And then third movement is like this, like this. So it's three movements. And we gave them instructions which says, put the pencil on the first green dot, near the front of the tractor or car, then draw a line over the green dots to the food, animal or flower, which are situated here, and then stop at the last green dot. So it's basically 1, 2. And that was the instructions in the book that the parent or carer would go through with the child. And on each page of the book, then you would have your practice trials for the day. So that to do 5 trials at symbol 1, 5 trials at symbol 2, and 5 trials at symbol 3. And this one is in a blocked practice, see, because it's all the same symbols in the first block, same symbols in the second block, and same symbols in the third block. 15 trials in total per day. And this is the random practice condition. So although they have 5 trials, there are different symbols. Look, so you've got symbol 1 is different than symbol 2. And obviously symbol 6 here then is different than practice trial number 7. So this is a random practice condition. Still 15 trials, but they are just randomized in nature. We also measured their pre-test performance where they moved on a Wacom tablet. So this is like an iPad, and we can now measure what the children do on the tablet. So this is that symbol there, look. This is the third symbol, and this is the second symbol, the third symbol here. And the same with the familiar English letters, which is a V, a K, and an A. This is the tablet that we used on the table. So we would put the symbol on the tablet. So if it was a K, it would be over here on a piece of acetate, and they use the stylus to go over the pen. And we can then take a recording of the hand at 120 hertz, which we're taking 120 samples of this pen in 1 second. So that's a lot of data points in 1 second. And it looks like this. So this is a children's movement when they move the pen on the tablet. This is what you're seeing. So you can see some of the movement variation when they go into the target and then they complete the task. Here are some examples of what parents sent back then. So these, as you can see here, then some marks. So there's like a drawing of a kind of a rabbit here in the middle. But you can see here then some of the movement attempts. There's quite a lot of variation here. That's not going over the lines, look. And especially here then it's going past the line and so on. This is some examples of this different symbol, a bit more accurate here because it's only 2 strokes, and this has 3 strokes here then, and a bit easier on these strokes here. So we would the parents would do the 15 trials a day with each child, and they would send back evidence of the activities to Tuche. So here are the findings then. On the y-axis now then we have movement time. A 0 would be perfect performance, a higher score would be a poorer performance. And what you find then with these different types of learning then, so the grey lines are what we call blocked and random. And then the black lines are what we call random and blocked. So this is the block condition first, followed by random at this switch. This is the switch point. And what you find then is if children learn in this blocked versus random condition, their performance is better than learning in a random and then blocked. Same number of trials, same time on task, but you get different performances of around about 1,000 milliseconds. That's 1 second difference in performance uh, if you learn in a particular context here. And this holds then to this difference here of around about 1,000 milliseconds, a bit over 1,000 milliseconds, is also retained after a month. So between post-test 2 and the retention test, which is a month period, they had no practice at this task at all. They were brought back and they retained this information importantly. So we get significant differences in learning styles if you randomize the practice in a particular way. Importantly, then, these are what we call our transfer effects. And these are when children now perform English letters after learning Turkish letters. And for the purposes of this particular study, then they've never done this type of task on the tablet or in the workbooks. We just show them at the end of the practice phase. And what you find here then is this group here, which is called the BR group. So the blocked versus random group then are significantly better at the end of the training on this novel but familiar task, unpracticed task, compared to if you learn in a random and block fashion. So the specificity of practice and how you learn then is having these significant effects on young children. These are 4-year-old children and how they learn these tasks. So the feasibility component of this study then, which was 100% of the parents said that the materials, the workbook, the instruction sheets and the training videos were user-friendly, age-appropriate and easy to use. For example, my son loved doing the activities after the AIMS protocol and is still asking to do the activities. 95% of the parents indicated that children did not encounter a problem with the 15 tracing trials per day over 6 weeks. That's really brilliant. The aims on the handwriting. So this is asking 89% of parents observed improvements in their own children's handwriting, as well as other skills such as holding pens and drawing and independent colouring. So the feasibility of doing a home-based intervention where you send this information back to parents uh, was shown to be uh, um, easy for the parents to do and have important effects on those children. So the take-home points from these 3 studies, as I said, I've gone through them pretty quickly to show you a bit of a story. So take-home points are there are sensory motor planning differences at the start of the movement. So when you're planning to execute the movement, my intention is to pick up a pencil, there are differences in motor planning movements for autistic adults and children. There are motor planning, motor processing differences at the end of the movements when you put the pencil into the cup. Then there are endpoint differences in variability. And then in terms of how children learn, there are differences in variability. But importantly, that variability now can be enhanced if you provide practice in a specific way. So we put block practice first to facilitate learning, and then random practice later to improve cognitive decision making, and motor planning to improve motor learning. So specificity of practice has a significant effect on learning in children on these relatively complex tasks at the age of 4 years old. And this is some of the first data that's shown this in this level, in this age group of children that are autistic. We are now currently looking at linking these motor learning processes to literacy skills in children that are aged 5 and 8. So we've done these 2 studies. We're looking at motor literacy development in a longitudinal study between 5 and 11. We're on sweep 3 at the moment, so we're working with 8-year-olds. And we're also using the Millennium Cohort study data to examine about 17,000 children from infancy through up to age 7 and 8. And we're looking at school readiness and developmental trajectories. That's it from me. And thanks to the volunteers from Autism Together, College Park, Cray, Spring Hallow, Phoenix, Plazenar, and a school in North Wales. And I won't go for all my collaborators over there, but they're there. And in the bottom right is my email address if anybody wants to speak to me, given we've gone through quite a lot today. Thank you, Brian.
Spencer, you've gone through a brilliant amount. It took me right back to my days as a primary school teacher and teaching that how to do your letters one at a time. And if I had known now that I wasn't to get them to do the same letter again and again, but I was to mix it up, this is the kind of simple knowledge that we should be passing on to our educators to make sure that good things happen in the school. So I want to thank you for your story. You started off with your own introduction. The fact that trampolines are involved.
Yeah,
Trampolines are the best things. Thank you ever so much for that. And you then took us through this lovely story about working with collaboration with communities.
yeah,
That it's always great when I don't know the polite way of saying this, when I talk to fellow older researchers, we have this history that we bring to it, despite being, shall we say, slightly grey-haired men. That this ability over years to go back to the communities, to know what the communities have told us, to sit with us and allow that to go through, it has made you a great researcher. The core researchers of sensory differences, I think, is deeply important because we live in a world that is designed for the majority. And for those of us that need a little pause in between doing stuff quickly,
yeah,
sometimes, I find myself doing, I press the button at the wrong time, I've moved things at the wrong time, I miss stuff because the world is not quite designed for many of us.
yeah,
Um, Looking at the third study and actually finding that the bit that I saw in there was, it was like magic that my child wanted to draw trees.
yeah.
And that's the bit, it's that joy of pen and pencil. And I think when we move into a more digital world, we've got to remember this original way of creating meaning that we've all been part of, which is holding that pen and pencil and bringing it together to make these ways of communicating. So
Yeah.
Spencer, I want to thank you for that. I'm going to ask if you have anything to pop them in the Q&As. I've got a few Q&As of coming across. Um,
Shall I stop sharing, Brian? Shall I?
yes, stop sharing at this point. Yeah, there we go. Uh, so there's a question. It's come from Michelle. Few questions. I'm going to ask the last question first, and then we might come back to some of the other ones because I want the answer as well. Is dwell time the
Yeah,
same as planning time for autistic kids? Can we
yeah.
correlate dwell and planning?
Um, so yeah, so effectively dwell time is a marker of motor planning time. So generally how you measure um, reaction time or response time is you would say, for example, you'd have a finger on a start or you'd have a pencil on the start. Yeah.
Yeah,
And then you get a countdown, one, two, three, go. And when you hear the go signal, it's the time between when you hear the go signal and you move. That is a
yeah,
motor planning response. So dwell time is exactly the same as that, because what the child is doing there then is they're moving to the target. Then they know they have to have a reversal, so they have to stop, plan their next movement, and execute that movement again. So dwell time is a marker of
it's a
motor planning
mark.
process. It's more like a response time rather than a traditional sense of a reaction time, but that's what it's doing, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to go to a question from the lovely Faye, who's been looking after the chat for us as well. Faye's asking, do you know how the experience of hypermobility appeared for your participants? We know that autistic people are more likely to experience hypermobility and things like EDS. Are these linked to motor differences themselves? And also to chuck in there dyspraxia too.
Um, okay. So when you say dyspraxia, Brian, you asking whether or not,
We'll do one thing at a time. We'll start off with hypermobility and movement. We know a lot of autistic folk have hypermobility, that the sort of stretchy joints. Does that link in? Was there any data that brought these things together? Do you know of any greater research?
yeah, yeah. So it's a great question. I mean, what we're also doing now then is, we've spoken about this then, is this data is group data.
Yeah.
So we didn't measure hypermobility or hypomobility in this particular study. I see there's a question by Maria as well about the intersectionality between ADHD and autism as well.
Mm,
Um, but what I guess the interesting question is, and I alluded to this in one of my first points, it's pretty clear now that most autistic children, most autistic people are showing motor differences. And the key thing is, and you touched on this as well, is these are differences.
mm,
In some of the older literature, you talk about dysfunction and impairments and language like that. That's you can still read it in literature, but they are just differences. Um, so what we've shown in our latter study there with the autistic children is that if you harness that variation in a specific way that
mm.
facilitates that particular child, you're actually getting these very profound learning
Yeah.
effects. So the original work on contextual interference was done in the 1970s, and it's a pervasive phenomena that is principally around cognitive learning, cognitive processing, and cognitive planning. And these are young children that are 4 years old, and we're showing these profound learning effects in retention after a month. And that learning is not happening without the involvement of cognitive planning around the motor system. And that's what we're showing. The
It's
question,
why I like this kind of approach, because we're looking at what the impacts are in the classroom,
yeah,
not really what's going
yeah,
on at a deep level, the sort of fundamental level, but actually what's actually real and out there and what can help. That's
yeah, yeah, yeah,
a very, very good way to look at things. Um,
yeah,
we've got one quick question. We've only got 2 minutes,
yeah,
which is the sorry, in the Q&A. Um, when you had the instructions made and given, who wrote the instructions?
yeah. So that's a great question. So the
Mm.
instructions were co-produced by with so in the autistic children in Wales, we spent about 2 or 3 weeks in the school working with the teaching assistants on and observing how the teaching assistants instructed in the classrooms of autistic children. And then we co-designed our frog. We call it the Frogster game. We yes, exactly. We've done it on. We did that original one was actually with physical objects. We've now done it on a computer monitor as well. So the design of the lily pads, the frog game was designed because that's what they were using in their classrooms, and the delivery of the instructions in that context were also co-produced with the teachers and the TAs. So they're kind of child friendly. They are context specific to these autism special schools. Yeah.
Excellent stuff. This is just a thought that you and I might have to go and have a pint about, because I don't know what the answer is. If you've got kids who have grown up playing good computer games, are
Yeah.
they going to be better at these tasks than I
Yes.
am? Yes, yes, they
And
will.
well, unless you've played at the same sort of level as
Well,
well.
I've been there. I really have been there. I want to thank you for the research that actually has targeted outcomes at the heart. I want to
Yeah.
thank you for sharing your stuff here at the Cray webinars. And I would like to say thank you to everyone who came to join us, and thank you for your questions. I'm going to say goodbye at this point. Goodbye. Look